The insult landed like a thrown wrench in a quiet hangar. Someone get the girl to bring us another pot of pupidi. We've got real pilots trying to solve a real problem here. Major Lucas Crane didn't look toward the corner when he said it. He flicked his hand as if shooing a flame. The laughter that followed was thin and dutiful, the kind heard in rooms where rank is louder than judgment. At the far end of the table, General Avery Dalton did not laugh. He watched the young woman in the plain airman's uniform, Captain Nora Quinn, as she steadied the carafe with one hand and set clean cups with the other, her posture quiet and exact. He had seen that stance before, a weight set over the archer's shoulders, loose head still, while the eyes moved the balance of someone who trusted their hands when the instruments went black. The slides behind Major Crane showed the same grim picture they had all week. The F-39 Spectre 5th generation showpiece budget bruiser, the machine that was supposed to guarantee air dominance for 30 years, kept finding a way to embarrass its makers. Two jets had entered a flat spin during the high-G maneuvers. Two had been lost to the desert and the sea. The simulations shrugged. The wind tunnel data wobbled between blame and guesswork. The engineers had the look of men who hadn't slept. The pilots had the look of men who were trying not to think about the way a horizon tips when a jet lets go. Its aerodynamic stall, plain and simple, Crane announced, laser pointer, skittering over graphs like a fly drawn to light. The flight-by-wire is undermodeled at the edge of the envelope. You need a stick and rudder man in there. Instinct. Feel. Not some computer nerd. He made the mistake of glancing toward Nora again as he said it. She didn't return the look. She folded the towel, placed it square, and stepped to the side of the room. Her stillness thickened the air. General Dalton let the quiet run long enough to see who would break it. No one did. Major, the lead civilian engineer, said at last, voice close to a fray, with respect, "What we're seeing happens instantaneously. We can't replicate it in software. Whatever it is, it lives where our models end." "Then fly through it," Crane snapped, as if courage could be bolted to an intake. "You don't fix a tailspin with a spreadsheet." Dalton looked down the table at his people. Good people, all of them, and saw a room that was circling an answer it could not name. He also saw the one person in it who had yet to utter a single wasted word. "Is that it?" he asked, voice level, eyes steady. "No other ideas." Silence replied. It was the kind of silence that, if you've worn a uniform long enough, you learn to recognize as the moment before something important happens. A soft rhythm of boot heels crossed the polished floor. Nora left the wall and walked to the whiteboard. Airman Crane said, half scold and half laugh, "Back to your post." She reached for a marker without a glance in his direction, uncapped it with a click that sounded decisive in a room tuned to small sounds, and began to draw. The first lines were not pictures. They were equations, lift coefficients, damping ratios, the language of how air behaves when it meets an edge. She added vector arrows to a three-quarter sketch of the F-39's fuselage, then traced the path of air across the port canard and into the intake. Her hand moved quickly but without hurry. She wrote a single number, 72 GWS2, beside a small oscillating loop just forward of the intake, then a note in neat block letters, phase coupling. No one spoke. Crane's smirk dissolved, then his frown did too, leaving his face blank. The engineers leaned forward almost involuntarily, seeing at last a pattern where a blur had been. Nora capped the marker and slid it into the tray. "The left canard is micro-oscillating under high transient load," she said, voice calm and unadorned. "It sheds a chaotic vortex right into the intake lip, not a stall starvation. At that frequency, the engine chokes. The left side unspools. The controller keeps feeding it. The jet yaws and flattens." "How did we miss that?" the lead engineer whispered, not to her, not to anyone. "You weren't looking at the canard as a source," Nora answered, eyes on the drawing. "You were looking at the intake as a victim." "And the fix?" Dalton asked. Nora lifted the marker again and drew a small strip at the wing root set at a precise angle. "A vortex generator, quarter-inch serrated. Change the upstream flow so the intake receives stable air at that frequency. It won't cost more than $1,000 a jet. $1,000 to save a $20 billion program." Around the table, shoulders sank and rose as air finally returned to lungs. Crane shook his head because a man with his kind of pride has to shake his head at something that undercuts him this cleanly. You can't know that from a whiteboard. You'll know it from a test, Nora said, tone unchanged. Dalton stood. He didn't look at the board. He looked at Nora's sleeve. There, small enough to be missed by a crowd intent on embarrassment, was a round, dark patch midnight blue with a falling star stitched in silver. It tugged a memory from long ago. Back when he'd worn a pressure suit more often than a dress uniform, there had been whispers of a unit that flew what didn't officially exist. Their emblem was a star that looked like it had the nerve to fall on purpose. He stepped closer. The threadwork left no doubt. Aurora Test Wing. Captain, he said, and the rank was not a guess hold, where you are. He turned to his aide. Bring up Captain Nora Quinn's record on the main screen. Crane started to protest that petty noise men make to cover their fear, but it died in his throat when Dalton's eyes turned to him. The file appeared in cold type. Quinn, Nora E. Rank Captain Assignment. Aurora Test Wing Special Projects Flight Hours. 4-300-2-200 Combat Experimental Specialty. Unpowered Flight Dynamics. Asymmetrical Propulsion, Emergency Envelope Recovery. Decorations, Distinguished Flying. Cross 2 Air Medal with VAI Joint Meritorious Unit Award. Foreign citations redacted. Notable successful dead stick recovery of damaged airframe. Korangal AAO redacted. Crane's jaw worked, but produced nothing. One of the engineers took off his glasses and polished lenses that did not need polishing. At the end of the table, a young pilot folded his hands to keep them still. Dalton faced Nora and brought his right hand up slowly, precisely, palm inward, elbow sharp. It was a salute different in tone from the 100 he gave each week. It was the kind you keep for equals. Captain Quinn, he said, my apologies for the ignorance of my command. The floor is yours. She returned the salute crisply, then turned back to the board, as if the legend that had just been read aloud belonged to someone else. Her task was the jet, not the theater. They didn't adjourn. They moved the engineers toward the hangar pilots, toward the simulator, the test cell crew to the bench grinders. Dalton stayed just long enough to watch the inertia go out of the room like a gust and leave purpose behind. Crane stood rooted until the last chair scraped, then found himself walking toward the sim bay without anyone telling his legs to do it. Nora was already there, not in the booth, but on the floor beside a crew chief, and a tech's sleeves rolled grease on her thumb where she'd steadied a cowl. She spoke softly, using the grammar of people who fix things short sentences. One instruction at a time, no words spent on blame. The crew cut a strip of serrated metal and held it against the wing root of the F-39 in the bay. Nora set the angle with a machinist's protractor, nodded once and stepped back. The crew bucked the rivets as if they'd always known this would be the job today. Crane watched her work and felt something unfamiliar settle into his stomach. Regret dressed as humility. He did what men rarely do when they've been wrong at volume. He crossed the room to the person he had wronged. Captain, he said, stopping at a respectful distance. I was out of line. Nora looked up, nothing in her face but attention. We're all out of line, she said, meaning the canard, the intake, the vortex, the small piece of wrongness that had betrayed pilots twice now. Let's put it back. He nodded, a motion that felt more like a bow than he cared to admit. The test cell coughed to life. In the simulator, they loaded the old failure in the new fix. A young pilot strapped in and glanced through the glass toward the whiteboard now propped on an easel. He touched the tip of the marker line with his finger as if for luck. Run it, Nora said to the sim operator. They sent the F-39 up into the same maneuvers that had wounded two of its brothers. On the screen, the data scrolled. Pressure at the intake lip smoothed where it had jittered. The canard trace hummed at a harmless note. A cheap strip of metal whispered its little miracle. Different air is different outcome. In the hangar, the engine on the test airframe spooled in rhythm with the sim's commands. Its readings mirrored the screen. The chief crossed his forearms without meaning to. I'll be damned, he said softly, because you don't tempt fate with loud voices when a machine finally chooses to behave. They ran it again and again. Pitch, roll, high G pull, the same result. Stable air where chaos had been. Waste heat in the belly instead of on a hillside. Crane breathed and realized he had been holding breath since the first jet went flat. Dalton came down from the briefing room, hands behind his back. He stood beside Nora and watched the third run complete. It's clean, he said. It's cleaner, Nora replied, neither self-protective nor dramatic, just precise. You'll still get edge cases at heat and altitude, but you've bought yourself margin where there was none. Fix it across the fleet, Dalton said to the chief. Today. Yes, sir. Name it, the chief added, a grin, trying and failing to break discipline. This little serrated angel. Dalton had looked at Nora. She shook her head once. No names, just installation instructions. Too late, the chief said. If pilots fly it, they'll call it something. Better it's not that thing the engineers bolted on. The grin made it to Dalton's face, now brief and satisfied. Publish the tech note as TCCTO 39Q. Field's going to call it the Quinn modification whether we like it or not. Crane found himself smiling, too small and rueful. They'll be right to. They could have celebrated. Instead, they worked. The fix went to the field teams before sundown. By morning, 4 birds wore the serrated strip and took the air. At the end of the week, a squadron on the coast put 6 jets through a combined exercise. Nobody lost an engine. The story of what had happened in the briefing room outran the technical order by an easy mile. The whiteboard equations were scanned and laminated. Someone printed in small type beneath them. Assumptions are the enemy. The sheet went up in the ready room at eye level. The new pilots stopped there first on their tour of the squadron before they saw the cockpit, before they touched a single switch. They traced the vectors with a finger and said the 3 beats out loud when asked cause-effect remedy. The culture shifted a half step, which is how cultures change if you're doing it right. The volume went down. The questions came sooner. Instructors started asking, "What are you missing?" before they asked, "What did you get?" Crane changed in a way that startled those who'd only known him as a slick laugh and a quick jab. He spoke less. He listened more. He kept a copy of the laminated board folded in his flight bag, and when he briefed new crews would tap it with a knuckle. Listen to the air and her, he would say. No apology, no theater, just the simple economy of respect. Dalton formalized what the hallway had already decided. Before first engine start, rookies would stand and brief the Quinn how a micro-oscillation becomes a fatal cascade, how a thin strip quiets a noisy flow, how small parts do large work when placed with purpose. In the simulator, instructors built a scenario that walked a student to the edge of the old failure, then watched for the moment when calm understanding replaced guesswork. You could see when it happened. Their shoulders dropped a little. Their eyes steadied. They stopped trying to bully the jet into obedience and started flying what was actually in front of them. 6 months passed. The F-39's reputation shed its wobble. Crews in other services asked quietly, as crews do, if they could get a look at the MODI and the math. The answer was yes, with the understanding that the story came with it, not a parable about a foolish major and a clever captain, but a simpler lesson written in the language older hands know by heart. True authority is quiet. It arrives without announcement and leaves a place better than it found it. One afternoon, Crane found Nora in the simulator bay, sleeves rolled, watching a younger pilot work an emergency checklist. He stood at the entrance for a long minute, deciding what kind of man he wanted to be next. He walked forward, not as a superior, but as a student. "Captain Quinn," he said, voice stripped of the old gloss. "There's no excuse for how I talked to you in that room. I was wrong." Nora's expression shifted the smallest degree, an acknowledgement without ceremony. He went on, "I've been looking at your diagrams all morning. I still don't fully understand the coupling. Would you show me?" She nodded once, then moved to the screen and drew the same loop she had drawn on the whiteboard that first day. He watched her hand and listened to her short sentences and thought not for the first time that some lessons arrive like thunder and some arrive like a tide, quiet and undeniable. The tide remade him in ways his friends were careful not to tease. He corrected people less and helped them more. He coached a lieutenant through a botched sim with patience that would have surprised the Crane Swift officer of 6 months prior. He took his knocks, laughed at himself, and spoke Quinn's name with the ease of a man who had made peace with being saved in public. In the weeks that followed, the hangar felt different, lighter, steadier, almost like the building itself had exhaled. The whiteboard where Nora had drawn her airflow and intake paths hung on the ready room wall, laminated beneath that small line General Dalton had insisted upon. The crews called it the Quinn equation without waiting for anyone's permission. Instructors worked it into doctrine. Maintainers pinned a small photo of the wing root strip beside the torque chart, not as a trophy, but as a way to remind young hands that detail is not a petty word in aviation. It is a holy one. At graduations, Dalton told the story in a single paragraph. He named Quinn and Crane and nothing more. The lesson wasn't about blame. It was about how a house learns to stand straighter. When older hands heard it, they nodded because they recognized the rhythm. If you've worn a uniform long enough, you know this truth. The loudest voice isn't the strongest hand. The strongest hand moves at the right time, no faster, no slower, guided by experience and humility. That's what Nora had given them, a permission structure to trade noise for signal, swagger for skill. Life off the flight line made use of it too. A crew chief with 20 years sat his teenage son down and said the sentence out loud, "Assumptions are the enemy." A widow in base housing taped the laminated caption to her refrigerator because the words steadied her as she learned to keep a life upright alone. A retired colonel wrote to Dalton to say that the story had reminded him not to interrupt his daughter when she explained her own work. He'd been wrong about the details and right about the principle. He underlined the part in his letter where he said thank you. Nora did not linger for applause. She wore the same plain uniform, the same quiet boots, and walked into the next problem with the same economy of motion. People learned her gait before they learned her face. They saved her a seat without making a fuss about it. When she spoke, the room hushed, not because the rank chart said it should, but because the people in that room had learned what it cost to be sure. The photograph of the wing root strip and the whiteboard remained long after she rotated out. New arrivals asked about the picture and were told that the steel and the ink were parts of the same act. Read the caption, someone would say, pointing at the small type. Then ask yourself what you're assuming today. If this story feels familiar to you, if you've seen quiet competence, steady a listing ship at home at work, or on the line say so, tell that memory, pass it to the younger ones who haven't yet learned the difference between loud and strong. And if you'd like more true accounts where calm heads and practiced hands change outcomes, stay with us. We'll keep telling the kind of stories that prove what Nora Quinn showed by drawing a few lines on a whiteboard and placing a thin strip of metal in the right place. Real authority arrives softly, and the proof it leaves behind fits on a small plaque and inside a steadier heart. Because in the end, that is the legacy that lasts, not the headline, not the ceremony, but the standard. A standard you can teach, carry, and live by. Listen for the signal, not the noise.